This video lesson is on thermoregulation, or regulation of body temperature, and here are your objectives. Now, body temperature needs to be kept within boundaries. This is a classic example of homeostasis. And in order to do that, the body needs to balance the gain of heat with the loss of heat in order to maintain a relatively steady internal temperature. Now, the human body is normally warmer than its surroundings, and so tends to lose heat because heat flows from warmer objects to cooler objects, and so I'm going to focus here on how it negotiates that. First, let's talk about how heat is gained and lost in the body. Well, gain is largely from internal processes. Again, if we're assuming the environment is cooler than the body, then the heat that is being gained by the body is actually coming from its own actions. First is metabolism, the sum of all the chemical reactions in the body. And those generate waste heat, and so that is one source of heat gain for the body. Metabolism and metabolic rate is controlled by thyroid hormones, and so thyroid hormones are involved in this way in thermoregulation, by controlling the metabolism or the rate of metabolism and therefore the rate of waste heat generation. Movement as well generates waste heat. You've of course experienced this when you exercise, and so the more you move your muscles, the more waste heat is generated from that process. Now let's look at loss. So loss is to the surroundings if the environment is cooler than the body, and there are four basic ways that this happens. First is radiation. All objects above absolute zero radiate energy in the electromagnetic spectrum. I'm going to write that as EM waves, and so that is one source of heat loss. The next is conduction, and this is where heat energy is transferred from a hotter object to a colder object that it is in physical contact with, that it is touching. And so imagine touching your hand to a cold surface. The heat energy is leaving your hand and going into the colder surface by conduction. Next is convection, and this is where energy is being carried away by moving fluids. For example, hot air is less dense than cooler air, and so it rises compared to the cooler air. And this is how radiators work. They're often stationed at the bottom of a room. As they heat up the air, that air goes upwards and gets replaced by falling cooler air, and the process repeats. That's convection. And then evaporation, and that is having to do with the fact that it takes energy to turn a liquid, like for example water, into a gas. That process of evaporation takes energy, and this is why sweating cools you down. In order to evaporate the sweat off of your skin, that requires an input of energy to move the water in the sweat from a liquid to a gas, and that energy is taken from your skin, and so your skin cools down. And if you think about it, by trapping air next to your body, clothes can actually decrease many of these losses of heat to the surroundings. And in contrast, fans, by blowing air across your body, replacing the air that your body has already warmed up that is immediately around it with cooler air, fans can actually increase heat loss to the surroundings. And that's why clothes help to keep us warm and fans help to cool us off. Now let's look at how the body regulates its own temperature. Receptors that detect temperature are called thermoreceptors. And thermoreceptors in the skin detect the temperature at the skin, and in the hypothalamus detect the temperature centrally and in the blood. So thermoreceptors in the skin and the hypothalamus in the brain detect temperature. And then the hypothalamus, being sort of the homeostasis center of the brain, compares these inputs to a set point for temperature and determines whether temperature is too high or too low compared to where it should be, and then it coordinates several responses. So there are blood vessels, small blood vessels called arterioles, that have smooth muscle around them and can contract or expand. They can close off or they can open up. And arterioles in the skin can do this, and we call that vasoconstricting or vasodilating. So arterioles in the skin can vasoconstrict, that is closing off or closing down, or they can vasodilate, that is opening up wider. And that controls how much warm blood circulates to the skin, which is close to cooler air. If you are in a cold environment and you want to conserve the heat that is in your blood and keep it from losing heat to the air around you, then the arterioles will vasoconstrict. They will narrow in diameter. Less blood will go to the skin, and therefore less blood will be cooled off at the skin. This is why the skin can start to look pale when you are in a cold environment. In contrast, when we want to lose heat, the arterioles can vasodilate, and that opens up, allowing more warm blood to flow to the skin, which is near the cooler air, and giving off more heat. And that then allows us to lose heat from the blood and cool down. And this is why when you're exercising, you can often get quite flushed. I'm using the terms like want to, but keep in mind that this is all completely involuntarily coordinated by the autonomic nervous system. And also, just to mention, what the body is doing here is prioritizing the temperature of the internal organs and the brain, and is willing to let the skin get a bit cooler. There can come a point where the skin gets so cold that it is at risk of being damaged, and so the blood vessels will actually start to vasodilate again to try and save the skin and send some warm blood there to prevent frostbite. And this is why you can also get flushed when you are cold as well. Next, let's look at sweating. So as mentioned previously, sweating increases evaporative heat loss. It takes energy to turn the water in sweat from a liquid to a gas, and that energy comes from the skin, and so the skin cools off. Now, more humid air is air that already contains a lot of water vapor, and it doesn't accept more water vapor very readily. More humid air decreases evaporation, and that makes it harder to lose heat by evaporating sweat. And that is why it can feel much more uncomfortable in a hot, humid environment than a hot, dry environment. Because in a hot, dry environment, we can still lose heat by sweating. In a hot, humid environment, we are much more limited in what we can do in that way. Conversely, fans increase evaporation. Once we sweat, we make the air immediately around our skin actually quite humid because it contains our evaporated sweat. And so that makes it harder to continue to evaporate sweat. Fans blow that humid air away and replace it with drier air that we can continue to evaporate our sweat into. And in that way, fans increase our ability to lose heat by sweating, and they make us cooler. So sweating is a mechanism for helping us cool off, and shivering is a mechanism for helping us warm up. Shivering increases waste heat produced by muscle movement. When you move your muscles, some of the energy goes into moving your muscles, and some of it is lost as waste heat. By increasing the amount of muscle movement through shivering, we don't actually move our bodies forward in space, but we increase the amount of waste heat that's being produced by all that little bits of muscle movement. And shivering is coordinated by the hypothalamus, but you can, to a certain extent, override it by voluntary force of will. A mechanism of increasing your temperature that you might not be familiar with is called non-shivering thermogenesis. Non-shivering because it's not shivering, and thermogenesis meaning generating heat. And it is carried out in a special kind of fat called brown fat that is particularly present and important in newborns. It's often located in between the shoulder blades in the back, and non-shivering thermogenesis, which is coordinated through the hypothalamus, helps newborns who lose heat very readily because they have a relatively large surface area to volume ratio. It helps them to warm up. It's not really clear how important this is in adults. It used to be thought that it wasn't important at all in adults, but now that thought is changing. How this happens, how non-shivering thermogenesis is done, is that in the mitochondrial electron transport chain, remember, a proton gradient is generated, and then protons fall down their concentration gradient through ATP synthase, and that stores that energy in ATP. In non-shivering thermogenesis, the process is called mitochondrial uncoupling, and that energy that is stored in the proton gradient, instead of being used to make ATP, is just released as heat. Normally that would be wasteful, but in this case the point is to generate a bunch of waste heat to warm up the infant. So that's called non-shivering thermogenesis and mitochondrial uncoupling, and it's promoted by thyroid hormones. And that's another way that thyroid hormones are involved in thermoregulation. Last, let's talk about goosebumps. Goosebumps are a vestigial response, in other words, a response that's left over from our evolutionary ancestors but doesn't really serve us. And in furred animals, our ancestors, what goosebumps would do is, if you imagine the little hairs on your arm being much more fur, that would give you a big furry coat all of a sudden. The fur would stand up, and that traps heat in fur. It's like wearing a big puffer jacket. It traps a lot of air, and that air is not moving around, and therefore it keeps the heat that is being radiated off your body in place. Another thing that you may have noticed is that sometimes you can get goosebumps when you're scared, and that is related to the way that animals' hair stands up when they are attacked or when they are scared, and that's to help them look bigger. And for us, again, it's just a vestigial response. So that's a quick look at thermoregulation and some mechanisms by which the body tries to control temperature.